I'm Fran Burwell. I'm a distinguished fellow here at the Atlantic Council in Washington, and I'm also honored to be a judge at the Schuman Challenge on March 31st. I wanted to give you a few preliminary thoughts and observations about the EU's global strategy and some questions that you might consider when putting forward how the EU will address the priorities in that strategy when we all meet on March 31st. First, I think it's important to understand that the 2016 global strategy is the update of the 2003 European security strategy. In that time, the world changed incredibly, and particularly Europe faced many more challenges than it had in 2003 when it had been in a very comfortable situation. First, of course, was the financial crisis in 2008 through, it's still continuing in some forms today with Greece and others as well at risk. Then we had the Arab Spring, which at first was very good news, but which has led in part to the conflicts in Libya and Syria, as well as some instability throughout the North African region. Then we have, of course, Russian aggression in Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, and the continuing irregular conflict in the east of Ukraine. And finally, not unrelated to the Arab Spring, as well as other conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, we have the migration crisis of 2015. Although the levels of refugees and migrants flowing into Europe has taken a severe reduction this year, we cannot be sure that they won't start up again, particularly as conflicts to the south of the EU may reawaken. So with that background and that understanding, I think it's interesting to look at the global priorities. But I want to underscore one other thing, and that is the centrifugal forces within the Union itself. We, of course, have the referendum on Brexit, and it now does look very certain that the UK will leave the EU sometime, most likely in 2019. But we have others, Marine Le Pen in France, for example, calling for France to leave the euro. And although I am not one to worry a lot about whether the European Union will actually survive, as opposed to have to retrench a little bit, I do think it's important to recognize that as Europe faces these challenges that I mentioned, and that you will have to deal with in your remarks and papers, that we also have a Europe that is questioning the current organization on which it rests and the goal of ever closer union. And so I think that is something, when we think about how others will perceive the Union, that is a factor in play. So let me move on to the priorities as spelled out in the global strategy. The first one is the security of our Union. This is the domestic security, if you will, everything from protection of the territory of the European Union to the actual security within the Union, from terrorist attack, climate change, all sorts of threats and dangers. And I think the main question to be asked as you move forward on this is, what are the capabilities that are needed for this? Are all the capabilities military? What are the police capabilities and judicial capabilities that are needed as Europe faces more threats of terrorist attack? What are the intelligence sharing capabilities that are needed? And can you do that with countries as diverse as Bulgaria, France? What do you do about countries who are clearly part of this network but may not formally be in the Union, such as Norway, or as the UK will be after 2019? Prime Minister May has made this, has emphasized the importance of continuing anti-terrorist cooperation with the EU. How does this intersect with the member states who are members of NATO? We've heard a lot over the past year from High Representative and Vice President Federica Mogherini about NATO-EU cooperation. But what does that actually mean, and how do you actually do that when some of the formal mechanisms continue to be blocked? What is the extent to which we can look to NATO-EU cooperation to address some of these things? And does the United States and the European nations, governments, see NATO-EU cooperation in the same light? Do we in Washington view the benefits of that and the scope of NATO-EU cooperation differently from, say, the governments in France, Germany, Poland, wherever within the EU? The second priority is that of state and societal resilience to the East and South. And here, this is an enormous challenge. And I think that the EU needs to, or you need to ask, what capabilities the EU can bring to that. And also, it brings up the whole question of enlargement. There is a real focus under this priority in strengthening the view that enlargement is something that is positive and that gives the EU leverage over countries to enhance their reform efforts and get them to move in the right direction. Is that still the case? Is enlargement still something that is politically feasible within the Union, and particularly if you move beyond the Balkan countries and start talking about bigger possibilities such as Ukraine? Turkey is still technically a candidate for membership. What happens with the countries to the south? They've never been on the membership accession list. So if the EU doesn't have that leverage, how does it encourage those countries to change? What happens with Turkey? Although still a candidate for membership, I think it is just really the EU and Turkey refusing to declare the divorce final, at least right now, given what we've seen in Turkey's domestic politics, that has made it still a possibility for enlargement, not a real possibility. So I think we need to ask whether the EU has other capabilities, other forms of leverage that it can use, whether trade agreements, visa facilitation, that it can use to shift the relations with countries to its east and south, whom it hopes to encourage to reform. The third priority is that of an integrated approach to conflict. And this is a real challenge. I have to say that the European Union has, from the very beginning of common foreign and security policy, had this idea of an integrated approach to conflict, going through prevention to conflict management and then post-conflict reconstruction and recovery, which is really to be applauded, this whole approach, because it's very comprehensive, much more so, I have found, than many of the American approaches, but it is also extremely difficult to implement. We know what needs to happen in many of these conflict cases, but it's very hard to get the political will behind the efforts. The EU has created lists of police and other officials who could go to conflict zones and yet faces serious problems in terms of actually getting them released from their domestic duties, particularly in a time of heightened terrorism in Europe, to go someplace where such police are needed, either for training or for actual patrolling. I think this is something that the US and the EU could do more together, but we have to figure out how to overcome differences in terms of which conflicts need to be addressed and how do we address them and who does what part. Do we both do all phases of conflict management, or is there a certain point when the US does more of the heavy lifting, and then how is that perceived as we go through this spectrum of conflicts? A very challenging issue. The fourth area is cooperative regional orders. Here I think there's a real challenge. The EU used to be, if you will, almost a proselytizing power, that it thought that its own approach to regional integration would help solve some of the issues around the world. Look at Mercosur, look at some of the issues in Southeast Asia, some of the efforts in Southeast Asia to create more of a framework. But I think with the EU now under challenge from within, its credibility in this area is is one of the biggest challenges. And I think that the EU has to directly address this issue of, is it actually a unique organization that Europe, because of its own history, has been able to succeed in this 70-year-old experiment? Or, and it's a bit frayed at the edges, to be honest, sometimes, or are there other areas where this can also be a way towards stability and peace? I look at the example of North Africa. After the Arab Spring, there was a lot of talk about how do you build more integration between the countries of North Africa. But in fact, when you have Tunisia next to Libya, next to Egypt, those three countries are very, very different. And most of their commerce ties were not with each other, but with different European states. And so how do you bring them together? That's an enormous challenge, given the different states that they are in terms of democracy, in terms even of peace and law and order. So I think the EU really has its work cut out there. Finally, global governance in the 21st century. Here, the EU has made a strong push to support multilateralism around the world. This is much to be admired. The EU has been a leader, and I think that one of the most important things that the EU can do right now is to help ensure that the new US administration continues to take a multilateral path and continues to act in support of multilateral organizations. The challenge for the EU will be whether it wants to be a leader in this area on its own, should the US administration move in a different direction. We see, for example, that the US and the EU were vital partners, along with others, in making the arrangement with the Iranian government over the last couple of years. If the US weakens in its resolve to support that, will the EU step up to the plate and argue for the preservation of that accord? The same with climate change. And I would argue, and I would challenge you to think about what happens in terms of what the EU should do, both to make the US or to encourage the US to pursue a multilateral agenda, and how it can do that. What is the case that can be made? And then also to think about what leadership role Europe can take on even more than it has in the past in this vital and important area.